Let's just get started. It's 10 after. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this RTAPP literature training. Before we get into the case studies and have Dewberry, one of our engineering firms, present on flood hazard mitigation, just want to give everyone sort of understanding of what the several roles here in the RTAPP program is, and give you an overall sense of what the timeline and what the process is for applicants at the time that they sign up until they get to the audit stage and then counseling. So the public-facing name is actually the Home Resiliency Audit. RTAPP is not really a very catchy name, or nor is it really indicative in terms of what the program offers. So instead of calling it the Residential Technical Assistance Pilot Program to homeowners, we're calling it the Home Resiliency Audit. This is just a basic overview of what the process looks like. So as many of you know, we'll be working with CBOs to conduct a lot of that outreach to homeowners in the 100-year floodplain and get potential applicants to sign up. So they would sign up through the website, as you know. At that time, they'll be at the pre-application stage. They would just fill out those few 4 or 5 questions. It will then get added to the center's queue. We will review and determine priority status, and that would essentially determine whether we get basically the full application for them to provide ID to us to make sure that they are the people that they're mentioning, or they would be put on hold if they are priority to priority 5 category. At the end of 21 days, which is the application period, that's at the time we would potentially open the doors for new applicants. If the ones that we accepted, if 75% of the applications we accepted are LMI. We'll go into more detail at the 3rd training, and we did mention this at the kickoff, but just want to give you an overview. So the center would then do eligibility. Once the applicant clears, they'll get to our hotline, who would reach out to the homeowners and schedule an audit. And they'll be in the audit with the engineering firms. The applicant thereafter would go back to the hotline and we'll schedule them for counseling, and then at that point they would sit down with all of you, or one of you, to go over the counseling portion. Once they're complete, then that's the end of the process. There isn't much follow-up. I think what we can start to think about is maybe doing some outreach to the homeowners 6 months after their initial counseling session to see what the status is, have they adopted any mitigation methods. So that's to be developed, but I think this is a basic overview. The center's role. So from pre-application to completion, the center will continue to serve as a main point of contact for applicants. So they can reach out to us with regards to eligibility, program status, and scheduling. We have a designated hotline staff that they can reach out to and call to just get any of those questions answered. We also have a live chat on the website that's available during business hours. So they can also chat with, a hotline representative, again, about any one of these things. And it really is open to anyone who accesses the website. So it doesn't necessarily mean the chat is only accessible to applicants in the RTAPP pool, but also it's for anyone who's going on the website and needs additional assistance. In terms of our role, again, we at the center would determine priority status, and that's based on income, whether they're in the high-risk flood zone, so the 100-year floodplain is, if you remember from our last training, if they're in the AE or VE zones, and if they sustain sandy damage. So those are our main criteria that we use to determine priority. And again, we can talk about the several tiers at our next training. We also determine eligibility, and by doing so, we identify verification of ownership, primary residency, and ensure that they're a 1 to 4 family unit. Because again, this is a single family program. Well, this part is a single family program. And lastly, we schedule the audits and the counseling session. So at no point will they be checking in with a counselor prior to this. The engineer's role, as I mentioned before, we have 2 engineering firms working on this program. We have Dewberry, who's a technical advisor to FEMA, and CB&I, also an engineering firm with a lot of relevant experience in doing a lot of recovery and resiliency work. They've also looked at build back. So we'll be having these 2 firms And their main role is, again, is to conduct the resiliency audit. They'll be providing an elevation certificate, which would include the VFE and the LAG. Can anyone tell me from last week's trainings what the VFE stands for? Nice. And the LAG? Lowest adjacent grade. I think I hear it. Right, yeah. Great. Perfect. We'll test you guys a little bit more. And then the last thing, the engineering firms will be providing a recommendation for the flood hazard mitigation options and will provide some cost estimations. So I think there was some confusion last time when Meg had her chart out that we were using to assess what someone's flood insurance rate would be given their current status. That would be provided by the engineering firm. So what the council's role is. So at our kickoff, we mentioned that you guys are going to become NFIP experts, and I think you are on your way to becoming so. So you're expected to really apply the knowledge of the National Flood Insurance Program. Information about the changing maps. We have to make sure that we have very clear messaging with regard to that, given last week's updates that the city wanted to appeal, and they're not adopting the current preliminary maps. And then also really talk about the long-term housing affordability and doing an analysis based on the homeowner's individual budget and their circumstance. So you're really just applying this really complex information about the program, about mitigation options, and talking to the homeowner about what's feasible for them for the long term, short and long term. So at the counseling session, we would want counselors to guide homeowners through the process of the resiliency audit, so really just discuss the results of what the engineers found. This would also, again, as I mentioned, it would include the flood insurance rate using the pre-FIR maps, preliminary maps, not the pre-1963 maps. Present the engineer's findings with regards to mitigation strategies, and we'll hear a little bit more about that when Dewberry comes. Address anticipated cost increases, and really counsel them appropriately in view of the policies and maps that are in flux. Yes.
So if we're presenting the engineer's findings, is there a separate deliverable that's going to the homeowner after our counseling, or?
So that's a great question. The final deliverable is what the counselors would be presenting to the homeowners at the counseling session. That would include the findings of the engineers, the elevation certificate. You're just going to get a single report with the findings of the engineers, the conversation that you guys have with the applicant, and sort of a summary of what the action plan is going to be, what the next steps are going to be. We did this for various reasons. I think counselors are best suited to sit down with the homeowner and talk to them, give you your expertise and give you, where you're coming from, and really serving LMI homeowners in the past. That makes the most sense for you guys to sit down and have this session with them. Also, it's supposed to serve as an incentive for people to get through the entire program. We know that there might be some drop-off, so it's great that they get this resiliency audit, but it's even better that they go through the counseling, because you can't really, unless they are themselves a flood insurance expert, that audit won't necessarily help them. So it's supposed to serve as an incentive for them to get through the entire program. Yes?
Is it anticipated that the engineers will be available to speak with counselors about what they are putting into their written findings?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Is it anticipated that the engineers will be available to talk with us?
Yeah, I mean, in what sense? Like on an individual case basis?
Yeah, if we're translating recommendations for a homeowner.
I think we can explore that. The way that Salesforce works, and this is, the software that we'll be using, the engineers will be using as well as the counselors, is that they are going to have set mitigation options to choose from, but they also want to personalize it. So they'll be adding some notes, and of course they're assessing and providing those recommendations based on the actual building itself. So my assumption is we can resolve that on the front end by being as detailed as possible, the engineers being as detailed as possible. But if there are outstanding questions, luckily we're working with about 1,500 homeowners, which for those of you who work in Build-A-Back or other recovering resiliency work, it's actually a manageable population. It's not the 24,000 people who enrolled in Build-A-Pack. So if we need to get additional clarification, I'm sure we can check in with the engineers about that.
Well, we're running through the report, or I guess through Salesforce in next week of the after.
Precisely, yeah.
And that's going to include all the different data elements that. Okay.
Exactly, right. So we did a preview at the kickoff of what it looks like in Salesforce. The accounting component is actually pretty straightforward. The engineers component is a little bit more detailed. I think they have about 150 data inputs that they need included. Of course, they're doing the whole resiliency audit, the site survey. So that's more complex, but you will have access to the final deliverable and what it looks like on the accounting side. So we'll walk you through it at the next training. So that's it. Do you guys have any questions before we get into the case studies?
Yeah, you say 1,500 homeowners. How many engineers are we working with on that?
So we have 2 engineering firms that are the firms who will be conducting the resiliency audits. And that's one of them in the back. Scott from Dewberry.
But how many actually?
Yeah, that's a good question. Scott, do you know how many engineers you guys will be employing to conduct the audits?
It will depend on the volume that we receive. I think we plan to deploy up to 4 teams if we need to. I'm not sure about the other firm, but as many as we need, basically.
Right. So we definitely have enough in order to meet the needs. Any other questions? I'm sure you'll have tons at the next training. Great. All right. Take it away, Brian. Thank you.
Somebody's got to help me get this PowerPoint going. I think if you go to the page, how to do that.
I say, look, I'm like a real trip.
That works.
I got it right here.
So hello again, flood insurance friends. All right, so I'm going to start with a kind of review of some of the things we talked about the last session, and then we're going to go much more deeply into how you give people rate quotes. So as Murray said, as part of the Flood Help NY outputs based on what the engineers put into the system, they're going to tell you what the client's unsubsidized rate is under the current flood maps and the unsubsidized rate under the future maps, which are now very much in flux. So, we're going to need to talk about how you talk to people about those future rates. Now, that's for the house as is. What you're going to need to do then is generate rates for the house, the cost of flood insurance with mitigation, right? Because that's the key piece of information that people need to know, right? Should I invest, $15,000 to fill in my basement or not? That depends on what their return is on that investment. So that part of it is what you're going to need to generate, and I'm going to show you how to manipulate the rate calculator in order to be able to generate that. Because otherwise, it's a lot of money for homeowners to be investing in without any understanding about what that's going to do from them in the long run. So you're going to get those starting rates For the future rates, you're gonna have to be getting those for homeowners. And I recommend, that you sit down and do that before you have the meeting with them, so you've got it all ready to go. And that you check it in a way that I'm gonna tell you how to check it to make sure you're not getting the wrong rate. Because, giving the wrong rate can have some serious consequences. Oh, hell. All right, so I must have this go. Okay. So again, just to review, there's two independent reasons why flood insurance costs are increasing, and we need to understand these. I don't know if anybody can read this slide, but I'll give it to you in a handout, right? So, from last time, we talked about the two independent reasons. One of them is that subsidies are phasing out. Subsidies on older homes built before 1983, that's 80% of New York City's coastal housing stock, right? Those subsidies are phasing out in 15 to 25% increments per year. All right, there is no question that that is happening. The second reason is, and that has already begun. The second reason is that the maps are being revised. So the preliminary flood insurance rate maps that were set to be adopted sometime in 2017 or later doubled the size of the flood zones and increased the base flood elevation requirements. That's now on hold because the city wanted to appeal. FEMA has to go back and redo maps. We just bought ourselves probably at least 3 years for homeowners to deal with this problem. The expectation is that because of the appeal, the new maps are likely to expand the flood zones less dramatically than the current preliminary firms, right? So that component, number 2 here, is in flux. It's going to get worse. Nobody doubts that it's going to get worse than it is now in terms of the scope of the flood zones. It's just, we can no longer point to the preliminary firm maps as an indication of what the future is going to be. All right, but number 1 is still happening. And that's why I really want you guys to focus on what people's subsidized versus unsubsidized rates right now are, or what their unsubsidized rate is going to phase out to, because that's definitely happening. And you can tell people this future, this is a good indication of what could happen, but the current rates, with and without mitigation, are what's definitely happening, no question. Go ahead.
Do we have a date for that phase out?
I'm sorry?
Do we have a date for the phase out?
It's already begun. It started in 2013.
And
So every year, based on particulars of the house, the rates are increasing 15 to 25%. So 25% is for second homes and for business properties, and also for some severely damaged types of properties. The 15 to 18% is the cap that Congress put on the annual increases. So the subsidized rates are being increased 15 to 18% until they hit the standard rate for
so that they're already.
It's already hitting. I mean, you're going to hear from clients saying, I can't understand, my flood insurance has gone up. But the problem is that homeowners don't understand that the increase they've seen in their 2016 premium is just the beginning.
Right.
It's not the end of where they're going. But for some people, those subsidized rates are higher than their standard rate would be, and that's something you're going to help them spot using that elevation certificate. So you've got a lot to manage in these counseling sessions, but it's doable, and I'm ready to give as many trainings as needed for everybody to get up to speed. And please feel free to contact me as you start getting your first cases to talk through how to assess these rates, and to just get a check on whether you're doing it right. I'm happy to do that. All right, so again, this is sort of the simple story of what we're talking about. The farther below BFE you are, the worse your premium. This is a house that's with the elevation of the first floor. This is a house without a basement. Is 4 feet below the flood elevation, $9,500 a year. if the house is, the first floor is right at the flood elevation, so this has got like a little kind of a crawl space kind of thing going on, 1,400. If it's elevated above the base flood elevation, it's 427. So essentially, the answer to your client's question, what would my flood insurance be like if I elevated my home, and according to the building code, they have to elevate it 2 feet above the future base flood elevation, which is still which has already been adopted for building purposes, that didn't change. They're looking at premiums of, you can just say $500 or less. That's simple, right? Elevation is the golden ticket. It's the way to escape long-term rising flood insurance costs. Everything short of elevating the home 2 feet above BFE gets a lot more complicated in terms of what the consequences are. Okay, so again, this is where we're ending up, right? This is basically what you're going to be telling your client. What happens to my premiums if I raise my utilities out of the basement? What happens to my premiums if I fill in the basement and install flood vents on the remaining above ground portion of the basement? And what happens if I elevate, right? So these are the things that you're going to be calculating for clients using Flood Help NY. The current as is, this is what you're going to get. This is what the rate calculator is going to provide to you and your clients. What is your as-is current unsubsidized premium and future, more or less, unsubsidized premium? These are what you're going to need to figure out for your clients. All right, again, just to review the factors that go into the premium, because in order not to make errors in this, you really have to understand what you're doing and why. The high-risk flood zones, what is their flood zone? X, AE, or VE, or no zone. The elevation of the bottom floor of the house, that includes crawl space floor, that's basement floor. If there's any sub-ground portion of the house, that's where it gets measured from, above sea level. The third factor is the base flood elevation requirements for the area, and the fourth factor, whether the house was built before or after 1983, that determines whether or not they get a subsidy. You're not concerned about the subsidies. You're concerned about the subsidies only to the extent that you can alert your clients when they're already paying too much. And 5, the building characteristics, whether there's a basement, crawl space, the number of stories, whether it's a primary residence, because that's going to determine which rate table applies to that property. Okay, so when you're getting a flood quote out of floodhelpny.org, and I'm going to walk you through that later on, as I said, you're going to be manipulating that program to give you the results of the house as mitigated. So you're going to imagine the house. If we think about, let's go back. All right, so this is the house the way it looks now. Let's say you want to figure out, all right, let's start with this one, without a basement. So you look at the house right now, and then you imagine, okay, what is this going to look like when they fill in their basement? Okay, they've lost, all this space is no longer relevant, right? Before they were measured from here, now they're going to be measured from the first floor above ground, right? So have that picture in your mind, and Scott's going to talk through the various mitigation, but in order to accurately enter the information that the floodhelpny.org site is going to ask for, you need to have a picture in your mind of what the changes are going to reflect in the house. So the first thing you're going to do in Flood Help NY is always treat the house as a post-1983 construction, post-firm construction. If you click, when the Flood Help NY's site, which we'll go through, prompts you, is this a pre or a post-firm house? Always say post-firm, regardless of what's true, because otherwise you're going to get the subsidized rate. You don't want the subsidized rate. It's not going to reflect mitigation. Well, it will in a tiny degree, but not to the extent that you need. Okay, so you're going to adopt that fiction for every rate you're calculating that it's a post-1983 construction. Then you're gonna adjust your answer to subsequent questions based on what the home will look like with the mitigation. And another, like Scott's gonna talk about some of the options for dry flood proofing. You need to understand, and I'm sure Scott's gonna mention this, that dry flood proofing for residential structures is not credited in rates. It's not recognized as a flood hazard mitigation measure in the flood insurance program for residential structures. Only what's called wet flood proofing or full home elevation affects the floor for rating. Okay, so we'll go over that a little bit more. All right, now we talked a little bit last time about the lowest floor guide. This is part of the flood insurance manual. You're going to get to there by just searching flood insurance manual, pick the most current one, and then you'll see a drop down for the lowest floor guide. I can walk you through this. And there it is. Okay, this is page 1. The thing you're paying attention to when you're thinking about a home relative to the lowest floor guide, and again, I'm showing you all this so that you really understand what you're doing when you're describing a kind of a mitigation. You'll see a bunch of arrows pointing to what's called C2A. Okay, so if you pull up the elevation certificate copies that I gave you, the redacted ones, you go down here, look at C2A. C2A in the middle of the page. The C2A refers to a line of elevation certificate, top of bottom floor, including basement, crawl space, or enclosed floor. So for most of these properties on, the first page of the lowest floor guide, it's clear what the floor for rating is. It's C2A. That line is the floor for rating. It's a little more complicated when you get over here to page 2. This is building diagram 9, okay? So look at the, I can't remember on the redacted copy, did I redact the whole address? Yeah. All right, look at the elevation certificate that on the second line has the entire address blacked out rather than just the house number. Building diagram number is line A7. It says building diagram number 9. That's a house with a subgrade crawl space. All right, so if you go to building diagram 9 in the lowest floor guide, it's got an arrow pointing to C2A or C2B. That's where your knowledge comes into play, right? You have to know, is this house going to be rated from C2A or C2B? The difference is mitigation. The difference is flood vents, right? If it's got flood vents, then it's going to be C2B. If it meets the FEMA's standards for a house with mitigation, it's going to be C2B, not C2A, right? So that's essentially kind of a visual representation of what you're doing by mitigating. You're raising the lowest floor for rating purposes. And again, if we go back, so got diagram 2A here. This is a house with a basement. Okay, so again, C2A, the basement floor is where it's going to be rated. If you fill in this basement and install flood vents, you've converted this into a home on a crawl space, which is, where's a home on a crawl space? Above ground crawl space. Yeah, it's basically building diagram 8, right? And because they're installing flood vents, you've raised it to C2B, right? So again, you've changed the nature of the house. You've changed the characterization of the house that's going to get plugged into the flood insurance, that's going to determine what rate is applied. Again, so that's just like, this is where you get measured if you're a basement. C2B is where you're going to get measured if you fill in and install flood vents. Okay, the other thing you need to talk about, because you're advising homeowners about eligibility, is these subsidies. You know, whether they're eligible for any of these subsidies, and it's critical to remember that some of these subsidies, the pre-firm subsidized rate and the newly mapped rate, are explicitly temporary. The preferred risk rate is probably pretty stable. Grandfathering, I think, is extremely vulnerable to congressional action. They tried to take away grandfathering already once. It was restored. I think they're going to keep trying. That may go away. So when you talk to your clients about grandfathering, which is what most clients are going to view as their lifeline, they have to understand that this is inherently unstable. If they can do one of the future, you know, risk mitigation factors that the engineers are going to give them information on, that's their secure route, not grandfathering. But grandfathering is something to fall back on, at least, you know, for the time being. Okay, so I was going to start walking through this particular house and how you deal with this particular house, but it might make sense, Scott, if you started talking about mitigation factors first, and then they have an idea of what the mitigation factors before we start going into specific rate calculations. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's pause. You'll now hear about mitigation factors, and then we'll come back to this.
Did you vote it?
Sorry, do you have the presentation?
Once they start to say we can start.
How are you?
All right. Once they.
Good question. Hold on, let me just.
If you go through, because he's going to pay for the institution, but I'm supposed to be private.
Yeah, we're having some fun.
Because if the person agrees.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Is there money in the
We should try that.
you know, it's not like elevation. Really, what we're looking at.
All right. Yeah, just drag it on. Okay.
Most likely, so someone to go out and get them all. Yeah, I mean, that's the only. Well, I think it's people's individual, projects, and it's really, for example, it's really, like, a lot of people have opted to outreach, and those kinds of stuff, which is good, right? Some people, even though they're in those programs, still do not want to outreach, because, you know, sometimes just, maybe they don't want to do that, they have preserved and so it really, you would, if you could imagine like all the different sometimes there's some people in the program who want acquisition from that. So like, this is too much, I don't want to I'm gonna see too much. Let me just get the program to buy my house and I know somewhere else. But that likely means that they're going to move to, you know, an area that's probably or something.
Let me get around here.
Right.
And actually use it towards the back.
That's what we're doing.
Make sure that it's going to be successful.
She said next year, that's all.
That's one thing that we're, should you guys push them along the way? Great, everybody's on it. We don't have, but you have to now, we're back on our budget.
Oh, it's
Well, you and I look at X, so we don't have a senior. You want to say no? Oh, you're part of our.
And I'm meeting you
No, I'm not. I'm a right right there.
Well, it's not feasible for us, it's like we're paying tax dollars. Yes, we don't have to tax the entire block. It's not very-
Thank you.
I have a big tax. Thank you.
Yes.
All right.
But I know that's it. But I know that.
Now you have a
But I won't do that. Well, I
Yeah, no, but that's.
Starting right
These are all So we have calendars. You guys understand. Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Choten. I'm with Dewberry Engineers Incorporated. We're one of the engineering firms that will be doing the resiliency audit. I want to be joined, hopefully shortly
Speak up,
by...
can you please speak up?
Can't hear you, Doctor.
All right.
Again,
I thought I was talking loud.
use your yelling voice.
My name is Scott Choten. I'm with Dewberry Engineers Incorporated. We're one of the engineering firms that will be doing the audits out in the field. We'll be joined shortly by one of our engineers who will be leading the audit team, Susan Tierney. So depending on the level of the technical level of your questions, I may defer a few of them. I also suspect that there may be a little bit of overlap with some of what was presented already and will be presented later, but I think that's okay because it'll give us the opportunity to reinforce what we're trying to learn and go through. I don't know who most of you are, so it would be helpful for me if we could just really quickly introduce your background so I can kind of tailor the detail that I dive into based on that. Or kind of, if you just say your name and who you work for and sort of what your level of experience is with the flood insurance program regulations.
Sure. Hi, I'm Danielle Bajuelo, and I'm a senior program associate with the center. And I am helping to manage the RTAPP program, and this is a lot of new technical information for me.
Hi, my name is Aaron Orlowski. I'm a program associate with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, and I help manage escalations for the build and back program.
I'm Courtney Corbin. I'm a foreclosure counselor. I do a lot of counseling at NHS.